July 8, 1947. An official press release from the United States Army announces to the world that they have recovered the remains of a crashed flying disc on a remote ranch in New Mexico. 24 hours later, that same statement has been retracted. Now they say it was just a weather balloon. A rancher who spent days being interrogated by the military told a reporter, "If I find anything other than a bomb, it'll be very difficult for him to talk." An Army intelligence officer, 30 years later, would swear that the material he touched that night was nothing made on this earth. What really fell from the sky in Roswell that summer night? Why did a simple weather balloon require the government to change its story? And why, more than 75 years later, is this case still the most investigated and debated UFO incident in history? This is what we know. This is what we don't know. And this is Roswell. Welcome. I'm Untold Nightmares, and what you're about to hear isn't a science fiction story. It's an exhaustive investigation of a real, documented case, with real witnesses, recovered physical evidence, and official U.S. government records. Over the next 4 decades, we've left no stone unturned. We've consulted declassified Air Force documents, FBI telegrams, contemporary press reports, taped interviews with first-hand witnesses, congressional investigations, and analyses from both sides of the debate, believers and skeptics. The Roswell incident isn't just the story of something that fell from the sky. It's the story of how a 3-day event in a remote New Mexico town became the case that defined modern UFO culture, fueled decades of conspiracy theories, inspired countless films and TV series, and, to this day, divides serious researchers about what really happened. Some believe it was the first documented contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Others insist it was a misinterpreted secret military project. And still others think the truth lies somewhere in between that we don't yet fully understand. By the end of this episode, you'll have all the verifiable facts, the theories, the contradictions, the unsolved mysteries. And then you can decide for yourself. To understand Roswell, we must first understand 1947. The world is barely emerging from World War II. 2 years ago, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, demonstrating a destructive power that changed the war forever. Now, in this new world order, a new threat emerges: the Soviet Union. The Cold War has just begun. And with it, a growing paranoia. Are the Soviets secretly developing their own atomic bomb? Do they have the capability to attack U.S. soil? The U.S. government desperately needs to know. That's why Project Mogul exists, a top-secret program that uses high-altitude balloons equipped with acoustic sensors to detect Soviet nuclear tests from the upper atmosphere. Thousands of these balloons are launched from military bases in the southwestern United States. Most land in the desert, in the middle of nowhere. And that's exactly what the government wants, for no one to find them. But 1947 is also the year of another national fever. On June 24, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying over the Cascade Mountains in Washington state when he saw 9 bright objects moving in formation at impossible speeds. He described them as moving like saucers skipping across water. The press invents a new term: flying saucers. And suddenly, the United States is plunged into a collective frenzy. Hundreds of people begin reporting similar sightings. Objects in the sky. Glowing discs. Craft that defy the laws of physics. By July 1947, newspapers were saturated with stories about flying discs. Public opinion was divided. Were they Soviet weapons? Government experiments? Or something more strange? Against this backdrop of Cold War paranoia and flying saucer hysteria, a small town in New Mexico is about to become the center of global attention. Roswell, New Mexico. In 1947, Roswell is a dusty town of about 25,000 people in the middle of the desert. Cattle ranchers, small businesses. Nothing particularly special, except for one thing. Just outside town is Roswell Army Airfield, home to the 8th Air Force's 509th Bombardment Group. This isn't just any base. It's the only military unit in the world capable of transporting and delivering nuclear weapons. The pilots who bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki trained here. Today's most advanced aircraft operate from these runways. Roswell's military personnel are among the most elite and highly trained in the U.S. Armed Forces. This is important. Remember it. 75 miles north of Roswell, in the middle of the desert near the even smaller town of Corona, lives William Ware Brazel. His friends call him Mac. Mac is 48 years old. He's the foreman of Foster Ranch, a remote sheep ranch where the nearest properties are 10 miles away. He lives alone for weeks at a time in a shack with no phone, no electricity, no running water. His family is in the town of Tularosa. Mac is a tough man, hardened by the desert sun, accustomed to solitude. He's not the kind of man who seeks attention. In fact, what he's about to find on his property will make him deeply regret ever opening his mouth. But first, you need to meet the men who will investigate what Mac is about to discover. Major Jesse Marcel, 40 years old, intelligence officer with the 509th Bombardment Group, World War II veteran. He participated in Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb testing at Bikini Atoll in 1946. He's no ordinary soldier. He's a man with access to top-level military secrets. Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cavett, commander of the Roswell office of the Counterintelligence Detachment. His job is to detect threats, identify foreign technology, and protect military secrets. And First Lieutenant Walter Oates, 25 years old, base public relations officer. A bomber during the war, he flew 35 missions against Japan. His job is to handle press communications. These three men are about to become involved in a story that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. June 14, 1947. Midsummer in the New Mexico desert. Daytime temperatures easily exceed 35 degrees Celsius. At night, violent thunderstorms cross the desert. It's the North American monsoon season. Torrential downpours, lightning flashes across the sky, and thunder rolls among the mountains. Mac Brazel is making his usual rounds around Foster Ranch, checking on the sheep, inspecting the fences. It's a job he's done thousands of times. But this morning, something is different. Scattered across his pasture, over an area about 3/4 of a mile long, is debris. A lot of debris. Sticks. Strips of something that looks like aluminum foil. Rubber. Pieces of what look like wooden beams or bamboo. Duct tape with strange designs. Mac doesn't pay much attention to it at the moment. He's in a hurry. He has work to do. Probably something from an airplane, he thinks. Or windblown debris. The desert is littered with military junk from tests and exercises at nearby bases. He'll leave it for later. 3 weeks pass. It's July 4th, 1947. Independence Day. Roswell is celebrating. Fireworks. Family barbecues. But Mac Brazel is alone at the ranch, as always. He decides to return to the spot where he saw the debris. This time, he stops to examine it more closely. And this is where the versions begin to diverge. According to what Mac would tell the newspaper days later, the debris was quite simple. Large numbers of pieces of paper covered with a foil-like substance and held together with small sticks like a kite. There are also rubber strips. Duct tape. Nothing particularly strange for someone familiar with military equipment. But Mac remembers something he'd heard. All those news reports about flying saucers. People are obsessed with the subject. Could this be? No, probably not. But it's worth asking. The problem is that Mac Brazel doesn't have a phone. He lives 30 miles from the nearest town, Corona, which only has a few hundred residents. And Corona is another 55 miles from Roswell. So Mac does what anyone in his situation would do. He waits. Sunday, July 6, 1947. Sheriff George Wilcox's office and tells him about the strange debris on his property. Wilcox hears the story. He probably doesn't think much of it, but with all the flying saucer madness in the news, he decides to make a call to the Army base. And this is where everything changes. The Army takes the report very seriously. Immediately, the base assigns Major Jesse Marcel, remember, an intelligence officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cavett, counterintelligence, to go with Brazel the next day and collect the material. Why send two such high-ranking officers to investigate what could simply be garbage on a ranch? This is a question investigators will debate for decades. Monday, July 7th, 1947. Morning. Marcel and Cavett accompany Brazel back to the ranch. It's a long journey along dirt roads through the desert. According to Marcel, they spend a couple of hours on Monday afternoon looking for more parts of the device. They find more scattered pieces. They collect them. They put them in bags and boxes. Here again, the versions diverge dramatically depending on when the statements were made. In 1947, Marcel would tell reporters that they had searched for more parts of the meteorological device and found some more patches of aluminum foil and rubber. His tone is entirely casual. Decades later, Lieutenant Colonel Cavett would describe the material as bamboo sticks and some kind of reflective material like aluminum foil. Nothing extraordinary. But 30 years later, in 1978, Jesse Marcel will tell a completely different story. He'll say the material was extraordinary, that it couldn't be bent or dented, that a sledgehammer would bounce off it, that it was nothing made on this earth, that he was convinced this was something no one had ever seen before on Earth. What explains this radical difference? Was Marcel lying in 1947 to protect a military secret? Or was he exaggerating in 1978, decades later, when his memory might have been distorted and UFO culture had exploded? We don't know, but you need to keep this contradiction in mind. What we do know is that Marcel collects enough material to fill his car. And before taking it back to the base, he does something unusual. He stops at his house. It's late at night. He wakes his wife and 10-year-old son, Jesse Marcel Jr., and shows them the debris on the kitchen floor. According to Jesse Jr., decades later, his father told them, "You're looking at pieces of a flying saucer." Remember, Jesse Jr. was 10 years old. It's 2 or 3 a.m. His father, a military intelligence officer, has just arrived with mysterious boxes. For a child that age, this would be an incredibly vivid memory, or one highly susceptible to distortion and embellishment over the years. Jesse Jr. will describe seeing sheets of aluminum foil that were incredibly strong yet light as a feather, and beams with writing that looked like hieroglyphics that appeared at certain angles. Did a half-asleep 10-year-old boy in 1947 really see that? Or was his memory influenced by decades of UFO culture and conversations with his father? Again, we don't know. Tuesday, July 8th, 1947. Morning. Major Marcel brings the debris back to the base. Senior officers examine it. And then something happens that will change history forever. Colonel William Butch Blanchard, the base commander, orders Lieutenant Walter Oates, the public relations officer, to issue a press release. And this statement says the following: "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to have a disc in its possession." Read that again. The official public relations office of a high-security military base, home to the world's only nuclear unit, publicly announces that they have recovered a flying saucer. The newspapers explode. The Roswell Daily Record prints the headline, "ROF captures flying saucer at ranch in Roswell region." The Associated Press distributes the story nationally. Internationally. Within hours, Roswell is world news. And then, just as quickly as it began, everything stops. July 8th, 1947. That same afternoon, the debris has been transported to Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas for further analysis, under the command of Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force. General Ramey immediately calls a press conference. And in those photographs, we see Ramey and another officer, Colonel Thomas Dubose, posing with debris. Pieces of what clearly appear to be a damaged weather balloon and a radar reflector made of sticks and foil. General Ramey makes an announcement. Mistake was made. It wasn't a flying saucer. It was a simple high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector for tracking. The July 9th newspapers corrected the story. The Roswell Morning Dispatch headlined, "Army discredits Roswell flying disc AS world boils," with excitement. Case closed. The Army made a simple identification error amid the flying saucer hysteria. An overzealous officer issued a premature statement. That's it. They can go home. Except that several things don't add up. First, how could Major Jesse Marcel, an elite intelligence officer who participated in atomic bomb testing, not recognize a weather balloon? Weather balloons are launched from military bases all the time. Marcel would have seen them dozens, probably hundreds of times. Second, why would Colonel Blanchard, commander of the most sensitive base in the country, approve a press release about a flying saucer without being absolutely sure what they had? Third, why involve General Ramey of Fort Worth if it was just a weather balloon? Why transport balloon debris 400 miles to another base? And fourth, Mac Brazel's behavior. July 9, 1947. Mac Brazel gives an interview to the Associated Press. And his tone is strange. He says, "They made a hell of a fuss about nothing. If I find anything else besides a bomb, it'll be very hard to get him to talk." He sounds annoyed, almost resentful. According to multiple accounts from people who knew Brazel, the rancher was detained and interrogated by soldiers for several days. When he returned, he was different, distant. His daughter, Bessie Brazel Schreiber, would say decades later, "Dad was disgusted, very disgusted by the way he had been treated." Frank Joyce, a local radio DJ, claims to have spoken with Brazel before and after the military interrogation. According to Joyce, in the first conversation, Brazel was animated and curious about the material. In the second conversation, after the interrogations, Brazel seemed under tremendous pressure and told him, "Our lives will never be the same." Why would a rancher who reported finding a simple weather balloon be detained for days? Why would he return traumatized and reluctant to talk about it? We don't know. What we do know is that Mac Brazel never spoke publicly about the incident again. He died in 1963, taking whatever truth he knew to the grave. And then silence. For 30 years, the Roswell incident was forgotten. It occasionally appeared in UFO books as a footnote. But most people, even in Roswell, didn't even remember it happening. Until 1978. 1978, a nuclear physicist named Stanton Friedman, who has become a UFO researcher, is waiting at a television station in Louisiana for an interview. Someone casually mentions that Jesse Marcel, the officer who handled the Roswell debris 30 years earlier, lives nearby. Friedman tracks him down, and what Marcel tells him rekindles everything. Marcel, now retired, says the material he recovered in 1947 wasn't a weather balloon, that it was something he'd never seen before, that the material's properties were impossible, that he was convinced it was of extraterrestrial origin. He says the debris in the photographs with General Ramey wasn't the same debris he had recovered. It had been replaced. Friedman begins investigating. He finds other witnesses. He conducts interviews. In 1980, he and other authors publish a book, The Roswell Incident. And suddenly, Roswell explodes. Books, documentaries, movies, TV series. Roswell becomes synonymous with UFOs and government cover-ups. More witnesses are beginning to come forward. People who claim to have seen the debris. Retired military personnel who say they were ordered to remain silent. Nurses who allegedly saw alien bodies. Every year, the story becomes more elaborate. More witnesses. More details. More incredible. And this raises a serious methodological problem. How do we evaluate testimonies that appear 30, 40, 50 years after the event? How do we separate genuine memory from unconscious confabulation? How do we distinguish between honest witnesses and people seeking attention or money? It is a question that divides researchers to this day. 1994, Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, pressured by Roswell-obsessed constituents, formally requests that the Government Accountability Office, GAO, investigate what government records exist about the incident. It's an official investigation by the United States Congress. It's not a small one. The GAO discovers something interesting. According to 1947 military regulations, all aircraft accident reports were required to be permanently preserved. But there is no official accident report for Roswell.
None.
Even stranger, many of the Roswell base's administrative records from that period have been destroyed. The GAO cannot determine when they were destroyed or under what authority. Is it suspicious? Potentially. Is it evidence of a cover-up? Not necessarily. Military records are routinely destroyed after certain periods, especially non-critical administrative records. But the fact is, we can't independently verify many details because the records no longer exist. The GAO investigation prompted the Air Force to conduct its own exhaustive internal record search. And in July 1994, the Air Force released a massive 1,000-page report, the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. His conclusion: Project Mogul. Project Mogul was real. Absolutely real. Top-secret classified program designed to detect Soviet atomic bomb tests using high-altitude balloons equipped with sensitive microphones that could pick up low-frequency sound waves traveling through the upper atmosphere. These weren't simple weather balloons. They were balloon trains, chains up to 700 feet long composed of multiple neoprene balloons, radar reflectors for tracking, made from balsa poles and aluminum foil, and sensitive sonic equipment. And crucially, declassified records show that Mogul Flight Number 4 was launched from Alamogordo Army Air Field on June 4, 1947. This flight was never recovered. Tracking was lost, and trajectory calculations based on the day's wind patterns suggest it would have landed exactly where Mac Brazel found the debris, 70 miles east of the launch site, in the Foster Ranch area. Mid-June. The dates match. The location matches. And the material? Mogul's radar reflectors were made of balsa or bamboo sticks covered with aluminum foil. Some were covered with duct tape with pastel flower designs, manufactured by a New York toy company. Remember the description of Bessie Brazel, Mac's daughter, who saw the wreckage when she was 14. He said, "There appeared to be pieces of heavily waxed paper and some sort of aluminum foil. Some of the pieces of metallic foil had some sort of tape attached to them, and when held up to the light, they showed what looked like pastel-colored flowers." It's an almost perfect match. The Air Force's official 1994 conclusion: the materials recovered near Roswell were consistent with a Project Mogul balloon array. There is no evidence to indicate that what was recovered in 1947 was from extraterrestrial sources.
Case closed.
Again. Except, many researchers, even some skeptics of the UFO phenomenon, aren't entirely convinced. Project Mogul's explanation solves many mysteries, but creates others. Problem number 1, recognition. Jesse Marcel was an elite intelligence officer. He had worked on the Bikini atomic bomb tests. He had seen weather balloons and tracking equipment countless times. Lieutenant Colonel Cavett was a counterintelligence officer specifically trained to identify foreign technology and threats. How is it possible that neither of these two men recognized balloons and radar reflectors, even if they were part of a classified program? Mogul's defenders argue that officials did acknowledge this, but couldn't say so publicly because the project was secret. Hence the weather balloon cover story. But this does not explain why Marcel, 30 years later when Mogul had already been declassified, continued to insist that the material was extraordinary and not from this earth. Unless Marcel was lying back in the 70s and 80s, or his memory was genuinely distorted. And here we enter uncomfortable territory. Independent investigators discovered that Marcel had exaggerated parts of his military history and education in subsequent interviews. He claimed to have college degrees he didn't have. He embellished his role in certain war events. This doesn't mean he was lying about Roswell, but it does mean we should take his later testimony with a grain of salt. Problem number 2, the press release. Why would Colonel Blanchard approve an official statement from the most sensitive base in the country announcing the capture of a flying saucer if he knew it was only Mogul equipment? If it was Mogul and it was secret, the logical thing to do would be to say nothing, to avoid drawing attention to yourself. Just discreetly pick up the pieces and move on. Issuing a public statement about a flying saucer seems like the exact opposite of what you would do if you were trying to protect a classified program. Some suggest it was genuine confusion amid the flying saucer hysteria. Blanchard genuinely thought they had something extraordinary, issued the statement, and then senior officers quickly corrected him. Possible. But it's strange that such an experienced base commander would make that mistake. Problem number 3. Behavior with Brazel. Why detain and interrogate a rancher for days if he had only found a balloon, even a classified one? Giving him a national security warning, making him sign a non-disclosure agreement, and sending him home, that makes sense. But according to multiple accounts, Brazel was treated almost like a prisoner. And when he emerged, he was visibly shaken. This suggests that something more significant was happening than Mogul's explanation allows. Problem number 4. The properties of the material. Jesse Marcel described material that could not be bent, dented, or destroyed with a sledgehammer. Jesse Marcel Jr. described hieroglyphics on the beams that appeared at certain angles. Bill Rickett, another counterintelligence officer, described the material as very strong and very light. You could bend it, but you couldn't fold it into creases. None of this describes standard neoprene rubber, balsa sticks, and aluminum foil. Skeptics argue that these extraordinary descriptions only appeared decades later, when the witnesses were elderly and had been exposed to decades of UFO culture and speculation. And they're right. That's true. But we can't simply dismiss the testimonies for that reason. Human memory is fallible, yes, but it's not automatically false. And then there's the matter of the bodies. As Roswell became more famous in the 1980s and 1990s, accounts began to emerge from people claiming to have seen not just debris, but bodies of non-human beings. Glenn Dennis, a funeral home employee, said soldiers asked him about child-sized coffins, and a nurse told him about autopsies on alien bodies. Other witnesses emerged with similar stories. The problem is that these accounts are extremely difficult to verify. The alleged nurse was never found. Glenn Dennis changed details of his story multiple times. Many researchers, even within the UFO community, consider these accounts unreliable. In 1997, the Air Force released a second massive report, this time specifically addressing the body stories. Their conclusion: witnesses were confusing events from different decades. During the 1950s, the Air Force conducted high-altitude parachute tests using anthropomorphic dummies. These dummies, some with unusual features, were launched from balloons and occasionally landed in civilian areas. There were also real plane crashes near Roswell during the 1950s with severely burned or disfigured victims who could have been misinterpreted. The Air Force suggests that civilian witnesses saw these events in the 1950s and, decades later, conflated them with the 1947 incident in their memories. It is an explanation that requires multiple people to confuse events separated by years or even decades. Is it possible?
Yes.
Human memory is notoriously unreliable, especially for traumatic or unusual events, and especially after decades. Is it final?
No.
The fundamental problem is this. Almost all stories about alien bodies appeared 40-plus years after the event. There is no contemporary evidence from 1947. No photographs. No documents. Only belated testimony from elderly people with memories potentially contaminated by pop culture. This doesn't prove it's false. But it's not solid evidence either. December 26, 2002. Walter Oates, the lieutenant who issued the original flying disc communique in 1947, signs a sealed affidavit with instructions that it be opened only after his death. Oates died in 2005. The affidavit was published in 2007. And what he says is explosive. In the affidavit, Oates claims he was taken to Colonel Blanchard's office on July 7, 1947, where he saw the wreckage. He says he described it as not of this world and of extraterrestrial origin. More shocking, he claims to have seen a curved shape on the ground that he couldn't clearly identify, but that suggested something biological. Oates wrote, I became convinced that the recovered material was from some type of spacecraft and its occupants. So, does this settle everything? Is it the definitive proof believers have been looking for? Not so fast. There are serious problems with this affidavit. First, Oates waited 55 years to reveal this information. For decades, in countless interviews, he never mentioned having personally seen the debris or anything biological. Second, by the time he signed the affidavit in 2002, Oat was 80 years old. He had founded the International UFO Museum in Roswell, a tourist attraction that depended financially on the Roswell mystery. Does this mean he was lying? Not necessarily. People can have legitimate reasons for keeping secrets for decades. But does that mean we should be skeptical? Absolutely. Testimony that only appears after the witness's death, that contradicts his previous statements from decades ago, and that comes from someone with a clear financial interest in the case, is not solid evidence. It's frustrating. I understand. But that's the reality of investigating events that happened 75 years ago. All right. We've seen the facts. We've seen the contradictions. Now, let's examine the main theories. Let's start with the extraterrestrial theory. The argument is this. A craft of non-earthly origin crashed in the New Mexico desert. The recovered material had properties that defied known science in 1947. The government, recognizing the massive implications of extraterrestrial contact, immediately implemented a cover-up. The pros. 1. The military's initial statement. Why would an elite military base publicly announce the capture of a flying saucer if they had no genuine reason to believe it was something extraordinary? 2. The narrative change within 24 hours. The classic reveal and then retract pattern that has been repeated in other UFO cases. 3. Mac Brazel's treatment. His prolonged detention, his emotional state upon his return, his subsequent reluctance to discuss the matter. All of this suggests he saw or knew something more significant than a simple balloon. 4. The testimony of high-ranking military personnel. Jesse Marcel, despite his exaggerations in other areas, maintained until his death that the footage was extraordinary. Thomas Dubose, the brigadier general who posed with the debris in Fort Worth, admitted in 1991 that the balloon explanation was a cover story. 5. The material descriptions. Multiple independent witnesses described properties inconsistent with 1947 technology, impossible to bend, extremely light yet incredibly strong, with strange markings or symbols. 6. The destruction of records. Why were so many Roswell administrative documents from that period destroyed? If it was just a mogul balloon, why eliminate evidence? The cons. 1. The timing of the testimonies. The most extraordinary descriptions of the material only appeared 30-plus years later, when the witnesses were elderly and had been exposed to decades of UFO culture. 2. Marcel's inconsistencies. His confirmed exaggerations about his military record and education raise questions about his overall credibility. 3. The lack of physical evidence. Not a single piece of recovered material is available for independent scientific analysis. Everything was supposedly confiscated by the government. 4. Project Mogul. There is a prosaic, documented explanation that coincides in time and geography with the incident. 5. The pattern of escalating revelations. Each decade, the story becomes more elaborate. First, it's just strange debris. Then, it's material with impossible properties. Then, it's alien bodies. Then, it's multiple crash sites. Then, it's autopsies and underground bases. This pattern is consistent with mythology growing over time, not gradual revelation of facts. 6. Statistical probability. If a civilization has the technology to travel light years through space, why would their ship crash in a desert thunderstorm? Now, the skeptical theory. Project Mogul with understandable human confusion. The argument is this. Mogul Flight Number 4 crashed at Brazel Ranch. It was a top-secret project related to spying on Soviet nuclear tests. The Army, amid the flying saucer hysteria of 1947, made a communication error in issuing the initial communique. Once senior officers realized the error, they quickly implemented a cover story, a simple weather balloon, to protect the classified program without revealing its true purpose. Decades later, elderly witnesses, influenced by UFO culture and with naturally degraded memories, unconsciously embellished their original memories. The pros. 1. Project Mogul was absolutely real, absolutely classified, and absolutely important to national security in 1947. Revealing its existence would have alerted the Soviets that the United States was monitoring their nuclear tests. 2. Flight number 4 is a perfect match. Launched on June 4th.
Lost.
Calculated trajectory matches the Brazil site. The materials described in 1947, sticks, aluminum foil, rubber, floral tape, exactly match Mogul components. 3. Brazil's daughter, Bessie, who saw the debris when she was 14, described material entirely consistent with Mogul, including the floral pattern tape. 4. Lieutenant Colonel Cavett, who investigated the site with Marcel, described the debris as bamboo sticks and reflective material like aluminum foil. Nothing extraordinary. 5. The science of memory. It's well documented that human memory is highly susceptible to contamination, especially after decades. Witnesses may genuinely believe they remember something that never happened or that happened differently. 6. The pattern of UFO cases. The vast majority of UFO sightings and crashed craft cases have eventually been explained as natural phenomena, conventional aircraft, or misunderstandings. Roswell follows that pattern. The cons. 1. The initial press release is still difficult to explain. Why publicly announce something you knew was classified? 2. Reconnaissance. Even if Mogul was classified, Marcel and Cavett would have recognized the basic components: balloons, radar reflectors. Why the initial confusion? 3. Brazil's treatment. A national security warning would have been enough. Why detain him for days? 4. Duboza's testimony. Decades later, he admitted that the balloon explanation was a cover story. Cover story for what? If he was a mogul, why not just say classified experiment, without giving details? 5. The descriptions of material with extraordinary properties. Yes, they appeared late, but multiple independent witnesses described them. Were they all conspiring to the same illusion? 6. The destroyed records. If Mogul explained everything, why destroy the base's administrative records? There are other theories, less popular but equally interesting. Theory 3. Advanced experimental technology. Some researchers suggest that what crashed was experimental or captured U.S. technology that the government wanted to keep completely secret. Possibilities include experimental aircraft based on Nazi designs captured after World War II, Operation Paperclip. Tests of secretly developed rockets or high-speed vehicles. Experiments with unconventional propulsion technology. This theory would explain why the material might have unusual properties, why secrecy was so intense, and why the government would rather have people believe in aliens than reveal real military capabilities. The problem? There's absolutely no documentary evidence to support this. And if such technology existed in 1947, we'd expect to see its development or implementation in later decades. We don't. Theory 4. Military experiment with human victims. A darker theory suggests that the incident involved a secret military experiment gone horribly wrong, potentially with human casualties, explaining the body stories. This theory is highly speculative and has no documentary support, but it would explain the extreme level of secrecy and apparent panic among the authorities. Theory 5. Compound confusion. Perhaps Roswell is not a single event, but multiple unrelated events that have become mixed in the collective memory. Mogul would explain the debris of 1947. Tests with mannequins from the 1950s could explain stories of bodies. Real plane crashes could explain victim testimonies. UFO culture and suggestion would explain the embellishment of details. This is essentially the official position of the Air Force since 1997. Here's the uncomfortable truth we need to face. No matter which theory you choose, there are elements that don't fit together perfectly. If it was Mogul, why the initial statement? Why Brazil's treatment? Why consistent testimony from multiple witnesses about the material's unusual properties, even in contemporaneous statements? If it was an extraterrestrial, why is there no physical evidence? Why did the most dramatic testimonies appear only decades later? Why do the materials described in 1947 match Mogul so perfectly? If it was experimental technology, where's the documentation? Where's the further development of that technology? And then there are the mysteries that no theory satisfactorily addresses. 1. Why were so many Roswell administrative records from that specific period destroyed? The GAO couldn't determine when or under what authority. That's odd. 2. Mac Brazel's behavior. His transformation from a curious rancher to a visibly disturbed man who refused to talk about it for the rest of his life. What did he see, or what was he told that affected him so deeply? 3. General Dubose admitting that the balloon explanation was a cover story. A cover story for what exactly? If it was just Mogul, a now declassified project, why not make it completely clear? 4. Walter Oates' affidavit. Yes, it's problematic for all the reasons we discussed, but it's also the sworn statement of a decorated military officer, signed with full awareness that it would be his final word on the matter. Why risk his reputation and legacy with a lie? I don't have answers to these questions. And honestly, no one does. Regardless of what actually fell from the sky in Roswell in 1947, the impact of the case is undeniable. Roswell became the most famous UFO incident in history, the standard against which all others are measured. It has inspired thousands of books, hundreds of documentaries, countless films and television series. The X-Files.
Roswell.
Independence Day. The language and iconography of Roswell, the alien grays, the government cover-ups, Hangar 51, have become part of the global cultural lexicon. The city of Roswell has fully embraced its legacy. The International UFO Museum attracts tens of thousands of visitors each year. The annual UFO Festival is a massive celebration. The local economy relies significantly on tourism related to the incident. But beyond entertainment and tourism, Roswell has had deeper impacts. In ufology, establish the research paradigm used to this day. Search for witnesses. Analysis of government documents. Pressure for declassification. The modern UFO research method was essentially created in response to Roswell. In conspiracy culture, Roswell was one of the first cases to fuel the government is lying to us about UFOs narrative. This distrust has spread to other areas. JFK, the moon landing, 9/11. The skepticism toward official narratives we see today has roots in cases like Roswell. In the citizen-government relationship, the 1994 GAO investigation set a precedent. Citizens can demand transparency. The government must respond. This eventually led to programs like the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ADIP, and the official recognition of unidentified aerial phenomena in 2020 to 2021. In fact, the Pentagon's recent acknowledgement of unidentified aerial objects that defy conventional explanation has renewed interest in historical cases like Roswell. Does this validate Roswell? Not necessarily. But it suggests that perhaps the public was right to demand that these phenomena be taken seriously scientifically. So, what actually fell at Roswell in July 1947? Honestly, after investigating this case exhaustively, after reviewing thousands of pages of documents, testimony, analysis, I still don't know with absolute certainty. And that's okay. What I do know is this. Something fell on that ranch. That's indisputable. The Army recovered material. That's also indisputable. They issued a statement about a flying saucer, then retracted it. Verifiable fact. Mac Brazel found something that disturbed him enough that he never wanted to talk about it again. That behavior is documented. Jesse Marcel, until his death, insisted that the material was extraordinary, even though it exposed him to ridicule. That's his truth, regardless of whether it was factually correct. Project Mogul is a solid explanation, backed by documentation and science. It explains most of the contemporary events of 1947, but it doesn't explain everything. And the things it doesn't explain are fascinating. Perhaps the most important lesson from Roswell isn't were they aliens, but something deeper about how humans process the unknown. When we're faced with something we can't fully explain, our minds fill in the gaps. We create narratives. We look for patterns. Sometimes those narratives are accurate. Sometimes they're not. Human memory is fragile. People exaggerate, consciously or unconsciously. Governments keep secrets, some justified, others not. The truth is often buried under layers of time, confusion, and agendas. But just because we can't definitively prove what happened doesn't mean we should stop wondering. Curiosity is human. The search for answers is noble. And mystery is what keeps us looking toward the stars. 75 years later, Roswell remains unsolved. Not because there are no possible explanations, but because no explanation fully satisfies all the facts and all the questions. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Because the day we answer all the questions, the day we solve all the mysteries, that's the day we stop searching.
We stop exploring.
We stop looking up at the sky and wondering, are we alone? And perhaps that's the real question behind Roswell. Not what fell, but what does it mean if something fell? We live in a universe of 2 trillion galaxies, each with billions of stars. Each star potentially with its own planets. The mathematical probability that we are completely alone is astronomically low. But the distance between stars is vast, incomprehensible. Traveling light years would require technology we can barely imagine. Is it possible that someone made it? That they came here? That they crashed on a sheep ranch in New Mexico? Possible, yes. Probably, I don't know. Checked, no. But here's what I find deeply human about Roswell. In July 1947, the world had just emerged from the most destructive war in history. We had detonated atomic bombs. We were entering a new era of nuclear terror. The Cold War promised decades of paranoia and tension. And in the midst of all that, we looked up at the sky. Not just afraid of what our ground enemies might do, but awed by the possibility that we weren't alone. That there was something bigger than our conflicts, bigger than our wars. Roswell, regardless of what it actually was, represents that moment of cosmic wonder. That what if? And maybe keeping that what if alive is more important than having all the answers. You've heard the facts. You've heard the theories. You've seen the contradictions and the unsolved mysteries. Now it's up to you to decide what you believe. Was it Project Mogul? Extraterrestrial technology? Something in between that we don't yet understand? Or perhaps, simply, one of those stories that will never have a definitive answer? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below sharing your theory. Which explanation do you find most convincing? Is there anything we didn't cover that you think is important? And if this episode got you thinking, if you enjoyed this in-depth investigation, I'd ask you to hit the like button. It helps a lot more people discover this content. If you want more investigations like this, paranormal cases, unexplained phenomena, historical mysteries analyzed with rigor but without losing the sense of wonder, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. We're already working on the next episodes. We'll investigate the Bennington Triangle, the Hessdalen Lights, the Rendlesham Forest Incident, and many other fascinating cases. I also want to thank you for staying until the end of this nearly hour-long episode. I know it's a significant time commitment. The fact that you've made it this far tells me you value in-depth analysis, rigorous research, and intellectual honesty. And that means a lot to me. Before you go, I want to acknowledge the sources that made this research possible. We consulted official Air Force reports from 1994 and 1997, declassified GAO documents, FBI files available in its records vault, contemporary press reports from the Roswell Daily Record and the Associated Press from July 1947, books by researchers on both sides of the debate, The Roswell Incident by Berlitz and Moore, Witness to Roswell by Carey and Schmidt, and critical works by skeptics such as Phil Klass and Robert Todd. Videotaped testimony from Jesse Marcel, Walter Oates, and other key witnesses available in public records. And technical analysis of Project Mogul from independent researchers and declassified military documents. All specific sources, links to original documents, and references are available in the video description. If you want to dig deeper, it's all there. One last thought before you go. Roswell teaches us something important about the search for truth, that it isn't always clean. It isn't always clear. And it's definitely not always satisfying. Sometimes the truth is that we don't know. And that's not giving up. It's being honest. But the search is always worth it. Because in the process of searching for answers, We learn about history, about science, about human psychology, about how memory works, how governments operate, how we create cultural narratives. And maybe, just maybe, we learn something about ourselves and our place in this vast universe. Somewhere in the New Mexico desert, under that same sky that Mac Brazel gazed upon 77 years ago, the stars still shine. The questions remain unanswered. And the mystery remains. I am Untold Nightmares. Thank you for joining me in this investigation. We keep searching.